Hi everybody, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Tuesday, May 7th today, and I'm doing a little live update from North Carolina where I'm hanging out with my family. And we're taking a look at a few major planetary transits that are happening this week. One is Mercury's conjunction to the planet Uranus. That's a big one coming up this week in the next 24 to 48 hours. Venus is moving through a square to Pluto in Capricorn. That's also a big deal. Those are two big planetary transits happening in the next couple of days. I thought I'd do a little update about this. Before I do that, I want to jump in and give a couple of announcements. So one is, you're probably looking at this picture behind me going, what are you doing? I'm in the Outer Banks right now in North Carolina. My family tries to come here once, sometimes twice a year if we can swing it. Usually in the off season because it's really cheap during the off season to come here. We try to hang out by the beach and just kind of reset as a family. So we picked such an interesting time to come here with Mercury conjoining Uranus because as soon as I began this adventure here in the Outer Banks, and Mercury was ingressing into Taurus, my computer crashed, and so I had to reset all of the settings on my computer, and I lost like everything on my laptop, which thankfully wasn't a lot, but it was like, what a way to start a vacation when I'm trying to get a little work done. And the main thing that I'm doing while I'm here is I am working right now on the presentations that I am giving this year at a few astrology conferences, primarily on the relationship between Eastern and Western philosophy in the history of astrology. So for example, I'm talking a lot about what do Plato and Pythagoras and the Hermetica and Hermes and figures like that in the West, and even some Egyptian mysticism, have to do with Vedic philosophical tradition. And it's especially important to look at these things because the two places in the world that practice horoscopic astrology still to today that are most deeply rooted come from sort of Western philosophical tradition and Indian philosophical tradition. So I'm looking at that and sort of preparing a talk on that while I'm here. I'm doing a lot of research and preparing, setting up my PowerPoints and stuff like that. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here. But the other reason that I'm here is I'm also fine-tuning the curriculum for my upcoming online astrology course, which begins in June, on June 9th. So it meets on Sundays for a couple of hours every week. You can participate live or remotely. There's 30 lessons in the one-year program, plus there are 12 guest lecturers, and that creates about 42 classes overall. And it's a one-year program looking at Hellenistic ancient astrology, looking at the theoretical and metaphysical foundations of the practice, asking questions like why, where, and why do we use signs, houses, planets, aspects? Where did they come from? What do they mean? It's a kind of program that's about learning how to think and enter into the mindset of ancient astrologers as much as we can, and then gradually build our way into interpreting and reading charts. So towards the end of the class, we bring in live clients and I read for them, and then we workshop it together. So it's a really great program. You can take it as seriously as you want. Some people take it personal, kind of spiritual enrichment. Other people take it because they want deeper astrological training. Maybe they want to practice for other people. Early bird rate is in effect right now. There's payment plans. There's need-based tuition for those who need it. You can check it out on my website at www.nightlightastrology.com. Go to the courses page. So I just put it in the chat box. You can see it, but it's nightlightastrology.com. We start June 9th. I'd love to have some of you there. The class is filling up. There's still room, so I hope maybe some of you will be able to join. So those are the couple of little announcements that I wanted to give. Now let's talk about some planetary transits. First of all, how about Mercury conjoining Uranus? I heard someone earlier today that I was working with, a client, say it feels like Mercury retrograde passed, but then it feels like it still feels like it's been really rough. Like a lot of Mercury retrograde type of events have been happening, or a lot of difficult Mercury things have been happening. What does that typically mean? Issues around mental, intellectual, communicative energy, technology, planning. Those are things that kind of sometimes get a little haywire. Mercury goes retrograde. Mercury loses maybe a bit of control when Mercury is retrograde. So why is it that Mercury might still be feeling, or might feel like why did my computer just crash or whatever? Well, two things. One, Mercury has been in Mars's sign right after a really intense retrograde where it was badly debilitated in Pisces. So it went right from the frying pan into the fire. We have seen Mercury go into a Mars ruled sign where its host is now the god of war. Not always easy. And then it had mutual reception with Mars in Gemini, which on some level is nice, but also implies that there is a Mercury-Mars connection. I managed, for example, to burn myself and give myself, like a blister 3 times in the course of the Mercury-Mars mutual reception. So even though it's good for some things, Mercury and Mars working together might be kind of a good thing. Mercury and Mars working together over the past couple of weeks or whatever have also been an indication of the heat and intensity surrounding Mercury. Now Mercury, and then Mercury went through squares to Saturn, South Node, and Pluto, also kind of difficult. And then, as if that wasn't enough, now Mercury's popped into Taurus, where it's immediately heading for a conjunction with erratic, destabilizing Uranus. So yeah, Mercury's been having a little bit of a rough patch. My computer crashed, and I had to reset the whole thing. Mercury, Uranus. So it's like that. Now, a couple of other things that you can think about in the next couple of days with Mercury, Uranus that are more maybe exciting would be sudden epiphanies, the feeling of sudden, unexpected awakenings, mental insights, aha moments, unexpected but somehow inspiring messages or messengers. You also think about the destabilizing of in Taurus, which is a stable sort of solid sign. You think about the destabilizing of fixed or overly conservative opinions or ideas, as suddenly there can be a breakthrough and an insight that helps loosen something up that's been very fixed. So that's another possibility. The erratic quality around Mercury is there, though. So, for example, on the car ride down here, not only did my laptop crash, but as Mercury entered Taurus, we also my daughter got car sick on the way down. It's about a 5-hour drive. She got car sick, and there's another like Mercury, sort of Mercury Uranus, like, erratic car ride for sure. So things might be a little not so stable, but that can be a good thing too. So you have that little bit of that in the air. I want to talk about something else, which is an idea that came up recently in a conversation with someone. Someone asked me, what do I feel? They asked me, do I feel that astrology is countercultural? Do I feel that astrology is a countercultural activity, a countercultural science? And this sort of, for me, it begged the question, well, how do we define countercultural? When I grew up, I had parents who talked about the countercultural movement of the 60s and stuff like that, So my understanding of the counterculture was something like this, and maybe yours has been similar. What does it mean to be countercultural? Well, it means, for example, that you're ahead of your times when it comes to art, music, film, that you don't just go with what's trending on the pop chart lists or whatever, that you seek out, the unknown or the hidden artist or the independent musician or independent filmmakers, or you kind of go against the grain and try to seek out quality in places that perhaps not everybody else is already looking at. You like people who are independent or who think differently from everybody else, right? So that, like, these are the kind of, like, just in a general sense, impressions that I had of what it meant to be countercultural. You don't do things that all the mainstream people do. You do something that's different. However, here's the problem. When I grew up, right, like in a, I was like junior high, high school, it was the early mid 90s, like that, and then into the late 90s things, got real crazy with all the boy bands and stuff like that. But I remember in particular the grunge movement, which is where I first started getting into rock and roll music, sort of early 90s alternative music. And one of the things that always bothered me, and I spotted it even from the time I was young, and I think a lot of people do as well, is the extent to which people who wanted to go against the grain were also trying to be popular, but they were just trying to be popular by doing something different than what everyone else was doing. So it was almost like, hey, if you hate popularity so much, then why are you trying so hard to be popular by doing something that's just, just sort of being anti-popularity or anti-mainstream? And then by doing so, the hope was that, well, hopefully more people will start to become interested in whatever I'm doing or whatever I think is cool that's ahead of its time, or whatever indie music I'm listening to, or you know what I mean? So I was always kind of like, this whole, like, let's be alternative, let's be countercultural. The fine line between trying to drop out of what the mainstream was doing on the one hand, and also just trying to kind of be a trendsetter in a different direction. And I was suspicious of trying to be a trendsetter in an opposite direction, because it felt to me like, well, you're still just doing exactly what you don't like about what everyone else is doing, which is trying to, be mainstream. You're just trying to institutionalize different things as the mainstream. So that always bothered me as a kid. I always just felt like there was some kind of hypocrisy. And that was why, even though I would try to pick up on the alternative trends, I always ended up feeling trendy. Well, sometimes I've noticed that when people, so back to this question, is astrology countercultural? Sometimes I feel like in order to answer that question, we really have to define what countercultural meant to ancient astrologers. Were ancient astrologers countercultural? Yes. But what did that mean? Well, insofar as the mainstream of all human beings and really all of nature is consumed by the objects of sense gratification, meaning that their basic concern is with eating, is with sleeping, is with mating, is with defending something that they feel like is theirs. Insofar as those kinds of activities really engaged and absorbed in the sensory material world and being identified with our sense of who we are and our happiness as experienced through the senses in the world, as long as that is our main preoccupation, our definition of self is in that matrix, and our definition of happiness is in that matrix, then we're a part of the mainstream. We're a part of mainstream life in the material world in general. So insofar as ancient astrologers and ancient mystics of all kinds were interested in seeking higher knowledge, higher truth, higher happiness, higher bliss, by identifying themselves as the spirit soul, and also seeking a higher taste, a higher connection, a higher kind of happiness or state of consciousness, they were necessarily countercultural. They were not, the way, what they were interested in being absorbed in was fundamentally different than what most people were absorbed in. And still today, if you look at people like the Dalai Lama, you look at people like Thich Nhat Hanh, these great mystics in our, a lot of people read their books, they consider them genuine lineage holders. These are people who are not identified with the mainstream, so they're countercultural in a sort of traditional mystical sense. Does not mean that they are anti world. Does not mean that they are trying to get everybody to become a Buddhist because this is really the cool thing that should be institutionalized and should be on the big screens in between your TV show rather than a Pepsi commercial. That's not what they're interested in. They're not interested in becoming mainstream. There is an evangelical component to what they do insofar as they believe that this path constitutes higher happiness and higher wisdom. And so they want to tell people about that. But they're not trying to become a big popular thing. So in that sense, they're countercultural. Ancient astrologers were also, in that sense, countercultural. Their life was to be absorbed in a higher state of consciousness, preoccupied with higher things. That's what it means to be an astrologer then. I believe that's what it means to be an astrologer today, though I believe it's also we're in a different world today. In some ways, it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to be absorbed in anything nowadays because of the incessant flow of distractions, distracting information, distracting clickbait, It's just very hard to be absorbed in anything, what to speak of higher matters. But I do believe that the point of astrology originally was to help us absorb our mind in higher truth and in higher spiritual techniques of ecstasy as well. There's actually a lot of very beautiful evidence that scholars have presented suggesting that many of the Platonic philosophies were likely married to spiritual technologies, not dissimilar from yoga philosophy being married to things like meditation and pranayama. If I'm a betting person, which I'm not, but if I was a betting person, I would place a bet that ancient astrologers were practicing techniques of spiritual ecstasy. That this was not just some intellectual science. That they were doing. They were absorbed in these studies, but they were also absorbed in spiritual disciplines. There's some of the evidence for this I'll be presenting in some of the talks I'm giving this year at a few conferences. But at any rate, that's beside the point. So if someone says, is astrology countercultural? My first response is, well, we really have to define what it means to be countercultural. Insofar as we're trying to start a new way of life that is anti-mainstream and we're hoping will gain on and grab more popularity and become more of a thing, then no, that's not countercultural. That's called trend setting. And it might be ahead of its times. It might be the new next thing, but the new next thing will eventually become the old thing. It only takes a matter of time. So to be really countercultural is to be absorbed in a spiritual way of life and to be absorbed. And that's very few people are actually doing that. And in my opinion, that's not going to change. So it's not feasible. I don't believe the material world is a place where you will ever see massive amounts of people like all being really at a high spiritual level of absorption. Because and again, that's something that our ancient mystics told us as well, is that it's never going to be a big popular thing. So at any rate, that's my definition of countercultural. Now, do I believe that modern astrology or astrology as we practice it today is countercultural? Mostly no. And I don't mean to be critical. That's just my honest response, is mostly no. When people, for example, get really they say, well, nobody has any respect for astrology, and it's not popular, and people think you're weird, or people, don't respect it as a profession or stuff like that. In that sense, yeah, in the kind of typical definition of being outside of the norms, astrology is definitely not taken very seriously, at least in the West. It's not, people don't, if you say you're a lawyer, oh, wow, that's a profession. But if you say you're a professional astrologer, it's like, cool, could you look at my chart? Like people sort of think you're Bozo the Clown or something. So yeah, there's not a lot, it's not like a mainstream In academics, it's not mainstream. In professional world, it's not mainstream. So yeah, there's a kind of an outsider status for astrology, but it's not the same thing as being countercultural. To a certain extent, I will grant that astrologers are interested in things that run contrary to the mainstream. But the other troubling thing that I see is I see many, many, many astrologers, especially the more that are cropping up now that astrology is gaining some traction or popularity in sort of the online framework, social media and stuff like that, is that you see more and more people trying to make astrology an everyday thing. But in order to make astrology an everyday thing, we have to plug astrology into everyday life, which for the most part involves self-absorption and consumerism. So most astrology programming that I've witnessed, and there's a lot of people that aren't like this, but a lot of popular astrology content out there is geared towards the individual's self-centered interest, which is mostly wrapped up in what's happening to me and how do I feel about it, in what is that? Just in terms of being a material creature who's identified with the mainstream way of life in the material world, which has to do with gratifying my senses. Like that's it. So a lot of astrology content is like that. A lot of astrology content is geared towards selfish interest and consumerism. Not consumerism as in, I have to go have a Porsche to be happy, but consumerism as in I'm identified with my material body, and happiness for me is determined mostly in terms of what's happening to me and what's happening to my body and my self-interest in this material story that I'm living. So in that sense, astrology may not be popular, but even though it's not popular, it's still trying to be popular. It's trying to appeal to popular sentiment and popular interest, which is self-absorption and material consumption. So to that extent, it's really not countercultural. Now, to the extent that astrologers are trying to shift our attention, our minds, our hearts, our way of life toward higher things, towards our true nature as spiritual beings, towards our true self as a soul, towards a higher state of happiness that's not purely defined by material interest or selfish interest, then astrology is countercultural. Astrology is trying to bring us to a higher way of thinking, a higher state of consciousness, and a higher way of being in the world. But usually it's not like that path for astrology will be as rare and as sacred and as precious as going to Plum Village and actually walking mindfully with Thich Nhat Hanh. Like, in other words, it's far less astrologers out there are always in any age, right? In any time period, whether it's traditional or modern, doesn't matter. In any time period, it's few and far between are the places where deep absorption into higher things are actually happening. That's why it's countercultural. So this was a question that I had gotten from someone, had been discussing in email, and I thought it was worth addressing, as Mercury is conjoining Uranus, which is really a kind of totem symbol for the countercultural life of the mind and the countercultural life of the astrologer. Mercury Uranus says, set your mind on higher things, set your mind on things outside of the mainstream, and define happiness as something outside of just self-interest and material gratification. So to the extent that we're doing that, it's rare, it's really precious. Not as many people, not as many astrologers are doing that kind of astrology, and we should be very careful about trying to, make astrology popular. Because for astrology to be popular, it will have to cater to the interests of the populace, which is exactly this kind of self-absorption and materialism that plagues so many of us until we find our way to spiritual life. And I'm not trying to sound like really, aggrandizing or arrogant here. To me, these are just very simple truths about spiritual life. So at any rate, hopefully that gives you some things to think about in terms of Mercury and Uranus. I'd love to hear what other thoughts all of you have as well. Now, in terms of Venus's square to Pluto, there's some really interesting stuff coming up. So the Venus square Pluto transit that's coming a little difficult. Venus is in a debilitated sign in Aries, a little bit more warlike, squaring Saturn, South Node, Pluto, and that combination has been rough on a few planets already. The Sun went through it, Mercury went through it, now Venus is dragging through it. I'm reminded of the recent Game of Thrones episode, which I will tell you, I read all the books, and then I was following the series, and then somewhere in there, I decided my wife and I decided that we didn't want to have a TV around anymore. So we got rid of our TV, we put it in storage. And that's been really, really nice, by the way. Speaking of being able to be absorbed in higher things, it sure helps not having the TV around. But at any rate, through the process of watching all of these, of course, I'm like, I've got to see the ending, you know? So we just caught up on some episodes while we're on vacation here in North Carolina, and not a spoiler alert, but there's kind of a battle of wills unfolding between Cersei, the sort of evil Lannister queen, and Daenerys, the sort of promising dragon queen. One of the things that's come up, and this is not I will not spoil anything. One of the things that's come up is the question of, should you fight evil with evil? You know, it's kind of this classic question of, should you stoop to the level of your opponent in order to beat them, even if the cause is good. You know, what kind of means or methods are justifiable when trying to fight for a good thing? This is very Venus in Aries, conflicted. Venus, peace, love, friendship, harmony, in the sign of Mars, the god of war, in a square with sort of ruthless Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn. Do whatever it takes, you know. So the ends justify the means. So this question right now of how far we're willing to go in order to achieve what is right or good, how far we're willing to bend the rules or principles to get what we want or desire, or how far we are compromising ourselves. Another way of looking at it. So those are deep kind of philosophical questions that are present right now in relationships and in negotiating conflicts or struggles in relationships, defining principles, defining values in relationships. Yesterday I wrote something about this, and I said, if the principle, if we recognize that a lot of the times our principles are things that we use as defenses, and we use them as defenses on behalf of something that's more vulnerable and more subjective and personal inside the heart, the soul, then we can revise our way of fighting with each other. For example, if I take as very basic and the most fundamental principle, if I take to be the principle of the need for love, that everybody needs to be loved, and if I can just remember that on a regular basis, then when it comes to understanding why someone's mad or why someone's defensive or why I'm mad or why I'm defensive, I'm always going to come back to the same thing, which is beneath all of this, there is the need for love. Beneath all of this is the need to love and be loved. If I can move past the battle of principles and go right back to the heart, then a lot of the times just recognizing that will inform my battle decisions. Which principles are worth keeping very fixed on, and which principles are worth compromising on. And not only that, but if I am going to hold to some principle within a confrontation with somebody, how am I holding it? Am I holding it in a way that recognizes with some degree of empathy my need for love and the other person's need for love? If I can remember that, then the principles, they become more flexible even when they need to be strong. We can be firm, but we can be flexible at the same time when we remember the basic need that everybody has for love. So this plays in to this Venus-Pluto dynamic in a very powerful way, because Venus wants harmony and Venus wants love, but she's dealing in a Mars-ruled sign with inflexible, powerful kind of, some very cunning Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn. And so the question becomes, in a battle of wills, you know, how can I assert the right thing, do the right thing, stand up for myself, have good boundaries, not become too passive or weak unnecessarily, letting people walk on me, things like that, without being overpowering or being a bully myself, right? Or the reverse might be the case, where we have to ask ourselves, how willing am I to compromise and to, kind of step down from having to be the powerful one all the time? But if we can step back from the principle level of the conflict with Venus and Saturn and Pluto right now, and look instead at the underlying emotional, spiritual, soulful need for love, it will be easier to deal with. So that's a few thoughts on the Venus-Pluto transit. So we're at about half an hour in. Those are the main things that I wanted to share today. A little bit on Mercury-Uranus and this whole idea of, is astrology countercultural? Should astrology be popular? Is it a good thing that astrology is popular? I know not everyone's going to agree with me on that, but I'll say it again. I don't think astrology is supposed to be popular. I don't think that most spiritual things that are worthwhile and healthy and good are ever meant to be really popular. And so I'm personally very suspicious when people get really high on this idea of whatever is countercultural, be it astrology or whatever, trying to become the next big thing or trying to take off or become bigger. And a lot of this has come up lately too, as we've seen, articles in the New York Times about people in Silicon Valley pouring money or whatever into apps and startups, and a lot of money being poured into astrology right now, apparently. And a lot of people have asked me, do you think that's a good thing? And I've said, no, I don't think that's a good thing. People will always say, well, but isn't it a good thing to be moving along a progressive agenda? I'm like, but being spiritual to me is not a progressive agenda. It's not an agenda at all, in fact. I don't think of it that way. And I don't believe that when things become really popular, there's a lot of problems that come with it. Look, for example, at the history of the Christianity and what happened as it transitioned from an underground movement of heart and spirit into an institution. Those things happen; they're inevitable. But for me, for something to be truly countercultural, I believe in part it needs to be humble and quiet. And that's not to be. I'm not trying to move into some. I hate all of the people who are pouring money into astrology, or I hate all of the people who are. It's not really. I don't think astrology, properly speaking, is trying to be popular, and I don't think people who really appreciate deep spiritual absorption in their lifestyle are also spending their time feeling really anti anything. Do you know what I mean? But I think that's what it means to be countercultural, because culture tells us that what defines your happiness is to get involved in these kinds of warring opposites constantly. I'm hot. No, now I'm cold. Now I'm hungry. Now I'm, all of this. This is popular. No, that's popular. They're doing it right. No, they're doing it wrong. That's authentic. It's inauthentic. The whole thing, to me, it really takes us away from the kind of absorption into a higher state of consciousness that astrology has always been trying to show us to. So at any rate, I hope you found that part enjoyable. And if you have more thoughts about that transit or the Venus-Saturn-Pluto transit, I'd love to hear your thoughts or experiences. Feel free to share them here or on my YouTube page. I hope you all have a very beautiful week. I'll see if I can show you a little bit of kind of where I'm hanging out. It's kind of cool to see. So this is, let's see if I can, I don't know how well you can see out there or not, but we're at the Outer Banks right now. So it's a nice ocean. The ocean is just across the way. I don't know, you can't really see it out there. No, you can't see it very well. It's just a hop, skip, and jump away. So we've been walking along the beach with the girls and bringing them outside. And Gigi just built her first sandcastle, which was really awesome. And we listening to kirtan and trying to enjoy the sunlight and stuff like that. So we're happy to be here. And it's too short. It's always too short when you get a little vacation. You go back and just, it's like, oh my God, when we're here, we're always like, how can we just live here forever? You know, like, so at any rate, I'm gonna take off and head to the beach with my kids right now. I hope you all have a nice rest of your day. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.